We continue to look at the shocking new report detailing how harsh American interrogation methods have led to devastating psychiatric disorders in former prisoners. The New York Times expose is titled, "How U.S. Torture Left a Legacy of Damaged Minds." It found at least half of the 39 prisoners who went through the CIA's so-called enhanced interrogation program have since shown psychiatric problems. Some have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, paranoia, depression, or psychosis.
For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by two guests. James Risen, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist with the New York Times. His new pieces are headlined, "How U.S. Torture Left a Legacy of Damaged Minds," and "After Torture, Ex-Detainee is Still Captive of the Darkness." We're also joined by Dr. Stephen Xenakis, a psychiatrist and retired brigadier general who's advised the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on military mental health issues. Xenakis reviewed medical and interrogation records of about 50 current and former prisoners and examined about 15 of them, more than any other outside psychiatrist. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jim Risen, let's begin with you. Talk about the origins of this series and what you found.
Well, thanks for having me. Matt Apuzzo and Sherry Fink and I at the Times began looking about 6 months ago at what we had heard from some good sources was that there was a pattern of psychological problems with the people who had been tortured by the CIA. And I remember the first kind of epiphany moment for me was one source told me he thought that there were 65 to 70% of the people who had been tortured were suffering some kind of problems. And then I talked to someone else, and I asked them about that, and they said, no, it's all of them. All of them have some kind of problem. And so we began to try to track down these people. Many of them are scattered all over the world in very remote places. They have, some of them are completely off the grid today in remote Afghanistan or Pakistan. But we found as many as we could, and we found that the pattern and the evidence of severe psychological problems is very striking.
James Risen, you write in the piece that the symptoms of the torture victims' experience were the same as American prisoners of war who were held by what you describe as some of the world's cruelest regimes. Can you talk about some of these methods and the similarities between prisoners of war, American prisoners of war, where they were held, and what you found about former Guantanamo and other CIA facilities?
Yeah, one of the things that's so interesting about this is that the torture techniques that were used by the CIA were basically reverse engineered from what's called the SEER program, which is the program set up by the United States to help U.S. military personnel deal with the torture that regimes that might capture them use. And they were based on the techniques that had been used by North Korea and North Vietnam in previous wars. And the CIA had decided to try to use those same techniques that they had simulated for practice and for the efforts to keep military personnel aware of what they might face, and then use them for real against CIA detainees. And so what we were using, what the United States was using, was some of the worst techniques that had ever been used to try to break people. If you got to remember that these techniques were designed to break people psychologically. And that's what we found, is that we broke people psychologically. And originally, the Justice Department had approved these methods in the Bush administration by saying that there would be no long-term physical or psychological harm to the people. But what we found is that that's not true. There has been long-term psychological harm. The only problem is the United States government never went back to check after saying and assuring itself that there would be no harm. They never went back to check to see whether that was true. And so that's what we've tried to do, go back and check and see whether there was long-term harm to these people.
The stories, the profiles of the men are devastating, Jim. Can you talk about Suleiman Abdullah Salim and the darkness?
Yeah, Suleiman is, he's from the town, Stone Town, Tanzania, Stone Town, Zanzibar, which is in Tanzania. He was a fisherman, and when he grew up on Zanzibar, he just was a very kind of a easy, what you might, in America, you might call him a slacker. He just liked to hang out and fish. And he kind of had a nomadic life early on. He wandered from Tanzania to Kenya and then finally ended up in Somalia, where he worked as a harbor pilot. And then after he lost that job, he ended up kind of begging on the streets of Mogadishu by 2000. And in 2003, he had gotten a job as a driver for a local shop owner. The shop owner's sister worked for a Somali warlord named Mohammed Deer. And by 2003, Mohammed Deer had cut a deal with the CIA in which he would turn over terrorism suspects to the CIA. And one day that in 2003, Mohammed Deer's militia grabbed Suleiman out of his car and beat him, and then picked him up a few hours later and turned him over to the CIA, which eventually he was thrown into a secret prison in Afghanistan where he was tortured. It's the torture he endured is really hard to hear from him, and that was, to me, the hardest part of doing this was actually hear the person that the CIA had tortured describe the torture that they had endured. You know, many of us have read about this torture in the Senate torture report or in the newspapers, but to actually hear someone and sit with someone who had to endure this is a very difficult process.
Jim Risen, we wanted to turn to Suleiman Abdullah Salim in his own words, speaking to the ACLU about the long-term impacts of the torture he endured.
Every time I think the flashback come, I can sleep, I can eat, I can smell. Flashback come anytime, you know. So must make you crazy. I'm so much pain, I don't understand anything. I have a headache, I want to vomit. I'm innocent. Why is it a bit like that?
I'm in so much pain, I vomited, I have a headache. Why are you doing this to me, he says. Tell us what happened to Suleiman. Where was he held? Who tortured him? And what did they do?
He was held, well, he was picked up in Somalia. The CIA arranged to fly him to Kenya, where he was questioned by the Kenyans. The Kenyans then turned him back to the CIA in Somalia. Then he was flown to Djibouti. And then from Djibouti, he was flown to a secret prison run by the CIA in Afghanistan, which he calls the darkness. I think it was probably one part of a CIA prison that it's now known as the Salt Pit. He was kept in total darkness in a cell where he was chained to the wall constantly with loud music playing 24 hours a day. And then he would be dragged out of the cell and then beaten in another room. He would be hung by chains while he was beaten and kicked, and then he was threatened with dogs. He was walled, which is a process where they put a leash around your head and then slam your head and your body into a wall. And then they would, one of the things that was worst for him was ice water dousing, which was a form of waterboarding, where they would lie him on a tarp and then pour ice water all over him, and then they would wrap him up in the tarp filled with ice water and then kick him and beat him.
Stephen Xenakis into the conversation. He's a psychiatrist and retired brigadier general who's advised the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on military mental health issues. Dr. Xenakis, you've reviewed medical and interrogation records of about 50 current and former prisoners and examined about 15 of the detainees, more than any other outside psychiatrist. Could you tell us what you found?
Well, I found that the ones that I'm asked to evaluate, that many, if not all of them, are still suffering with the consequences of what they had been subjected to. They have all the symptoms that we commonly attribute to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. They have nightmares. Anything can trigger them. They just feel lost sometimes in their world. They have problems getting adjusted. It has significantly affected their lives.
Well, in 2013, you examined Tariq al-Sawa, and in a plea for better medical treatment, you told a judge that Mr. al-Sawa's mental state has worsened and he appears apathetic with diminished will to live. The military responded that he was offered excellent medical care, but then refused it.
Well, you know, the detainees in Guantanamo are offered medical care, and they'll have technicians and occasionally psychologists and other physicians who will be available to them. But the entire environment is not conducive to the quality care that they need for any number of reasons. And there's no doubt that Mr. al-Sawa did not feel comfortable with the practitioners there, the clinicians who reached out to him, and also that many of them really had not had experiences with them. So it's the definition of quality here gets into the debate. I mean, is this really what is best for an individual who's been subjected to torture? How many of the clinicians have had experiences with people who've had torture? Do people understand the environment that they're in? Do people, even in the cases we published, Dr. Capino and I published an article, said in our review of the histories in the medical records, we found that many of these clinicians didn't really ask about the details of what these people had experienced, and really didn't set the stage for there to be good rapport and to have and to be able to treat them and help them in the way that they needed. So there is a gap between what we think is quality medical care and what the Department of Defense said was quality medical care.
And Dr. Xenakis, the similarity between some of the people, some of the prisoners, ex-prisoners you examined, and soldiers you've treated decades ago coming back from Vietnam who'd suffered horrific abuse.
Well, that was what was stunning and perhaps in some ways obvious. I, as a young doctor in the 70s during the Vietnam War, had evaluated returnees from Vietnam, former prisoners of war, and we saw that these people were really suffering as well. And there's a record of that. I mean, the Department of Defense, had tracked these POWs for many, many years. We knew that these people were affected. We knew that it really made their lives extremely difficult. There was no surprise that if we, in fact, subjected these men that now we have during the Iraq-Afghanistan war to those kinds of circumstances and situations, that they too would suffer long-term consequences. And in fact, there is a vast similarity. People are people, you know, their psychology is the same.
So, James Risen, at this point, with these prisoners, what recourse do they have? Is there any way to get compensation from the U.S. government? These are the questions that we have right now. But I want to first go to Khalid al-Masri, in his own words, describing his time inside a secret CIA prison in Afghanistan.
I would like to thank the court for trusting me and releasing me. I would like to thank my Dennis and Nate, my lawyers, and their families for all the work they've been working for such a long time. And I would like to thank the Canadian public for
I want to go back to
trusting me and giving me a chance.
I want to correct who this is. We're going to start it at the beginning. Omar Khadr, once the youngest prisoner held on terror charges at Guantanamo, released on bail from a Canadian prison last year, briefly speaking to the media after he was released.
I would like to thank the court for trusting me and releasing me. I would like to thank my Dennis and Nate, my lawyers, and their families for all the work they've been working for such a long time. And I would like to thank the Canadian public for trusting me and giving me a chance. It might be sometimes, but I will prove to them that I'm more than what they thought of me, and I'll prove to them that I'm a good person. Thank you very much. That
was Omar Khadr, once the youngest prisoner held on terror charges at Guantanamo Bay. This is Democracy Now! We want to thank James Risen and Dr. Xenakis, and we're going to continue our discussion and post it online at democracynow.org. The series in the New York Times, stunning series, written by James Risen, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, and his colleagues, we'll link to at democracynow.org. A very happy birthday to Miguel Noguera. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.